Hey there, Anna McKinley here, and thanks for joining me. So, I'm going to talk to you today about how you can become a strategic optimist. What do I even mean by that? Well, I'll explain to you, and I'll also cover why it's so important, particularly now when we're in a state of really rapid change and people around the world are facing a number of challenges in 2020, right? So we'll talk about why it's important, what I mean by strategic optimist, and also a very practical method you can use to help you intentionally choose your perspective, to choose to take an optimistic perspective or a pessimistic perspective to what's happening in life strategically in a way that's most resourceful for you. Sound interesting? Well, let's get going then, because, as I said, the world is in a state of rapid change right now. I mean, we've already got accelerating technological change, and then we've got the pandemic and the lockdown quarantine, which a number of people are still in, and that's been changing the way that many of us are living and working, and directly impacting for many people on jobs, businesses, work, that kind of thing as well. Globally right now, I'm in the middle of June 2020 right now, around the world people are also taking to the streets and getting online to have their voices heard and to share the message that Black Lives Matter and indeed that people matter. As well as this, we've got some economic pressures and business pressures as the pandemic-fueled recession plays out, which is very significant, of course. And as we look ahead to the second half of 2020, we're looking at what we're calling a new normal. The world's not the same as it was in the start of the year. And our new normal is a world where resilience and the ability to adapt is more important than ever. And something that we've been seeing a lot more of over the last few months is people online, on social media platforms and in blogs and so on, places like LinkedIn and Facebook and YouTube and elsewhere, actually getting real and open and authentic about the impact that all this is having, about the challenges of staying positive and resourceful in this environment, and the emotional roller coaster that this year has been so far. And I think that's really interesting. It highlights, I think, a couple of things. And the first one is, I am an intentional optimist, and so I always look for different perspectives on things. And one that I look at is, gosh, just the fact that we're seeing people being so open about the challenges tells us how far we have actually come. Even just a few years ago, we did not see this level of real human authenticity in public, let alone online, right? It was just too vulnerable. And it wasn't perceived as being okay to be open and to be honest and authentic online. And yet we're seeing that more and more. So for me, just the fact that people feel now that it is okay to get on a platform like LinkedIn and share the real world truths about what's going on right now, well, that gives me hope that we are actually moving to a more accepting and more open-minded world. But also there's something else that comes into play. As I've said, yes, I am an intentional optimist. And that does bring me to the second thing that this is bringing to mind. Now more than ever, it is so important that we support each other through the challenges, and so important for us to practice the skills of managing our perspective, because that's essentially what this is all about. So what I'd like to do in the spirit of both those things is to share with you today something that has been absolutely transformative for me, in the hope that it will also help you to stay resilient and adaptive and to help you ride the wave, right? To help you adapt to whatever's coming next. This is a concept that was introduced to me years ago. It's the concept of learned optimism. And in fact, this book, Learned Optimism, by Martin Seligman, who many regard as one of the fathers of the field of positive psychology, who's made it his life's work really to study this type of thing, optimism and happiness and well-being. And look, as I said, this book and this concept had a very profound impact for me personally, because it helped me to adapt to some very significant challenges I was facing in my life at the time. But I've also helped others to take this kind of approach in their businesses and lives. And look, the impact is really quite significant. You know, like many people, I used to think that in the world there are optimists and there are pessimists, and you were one or the other, right? You know, that's just the way we were. We were. You were born like that, like introvert and extrovert, right? These were the different flavors that people came in. And, you know, we'd hoped that we'd come out lucky and fall in the optimists camp because, you know, we know intuitively, and the research tells us absolutely, that optimists often fare better than pessimists. Not only do they just generally have a happier life, right? But have you noticed how things just seem to work out for the optimist? They can sort of ride the crest of the wave and not get touched by things in the same way as other more pessimistic people. The research tells us that the people who consistently take a more optimistic perspective are able to accomplish more, of course tend to be happier, are protected against depression and similar states of mind, and even tend to be healthier. Get this, optimism can actually enhance our immunity and our physical well-being. Something that's super important right now, yeah? And it may even increase our longevity, how long we live. Isn't that something worth actually looking into? And here's the thing, while we all have a basic kind of default setting, a starting point in terms of where we sit on the pessimistic to optimistic continuum, right? The good news is that we can learn to be more optimistic. We can look at optimism, taking an optimistic perspective, as actually a skill that we can learn, that we can practice, and that we can strategically choose to apply in our life to help us be more resilient, to help us adapt, to help us rise to the challenges, and to help us get outside the box that we otherwise get stuck in. And so that's why I want to talk to you, because certainly the curveballs of life are flying around right now, and we all need the skills to be able to adapt to them. And look, I also want to be clear, because it's at about this point in the conversation that usually the pessimists are putting up their hand and saying, well, Anna, the world's just not the kind of place where you can just put on rose-tinted glasses and think a happy thought and everything will be fine. We need to be realistic, particularly in times like this. Which I say absolutely. But choosing an optimistic outlook is not about just think a happy thought. It's not about the school of just think positive all the time and everything will be fine. That's actually not what we're talking about here. What I'm actually talking about is firstly being aware and balanced in terms of the perspective we take, being strategic about choosing a perspective that is most resourceful in any given circumstance to help us choose how we respond to things. And optimism is not just about think a happy thought and everything will be fine. It is actually about taking a more balanced, non-negative viewpoint, which is very different. And I'll come back to that as well. But look, let's start by talking about, well, actually what is optimism and pessimism really? Because most of us use the words, but often we don't have a consistent or agreed meaning to them. So primarily, optimism and pessimism are really about how we respond to the setbacks in life. How do we respond when things don't go as planned, when we hit bumps in the road, adverse events? And a pessimist, when a bad event or adverse event happens, a pessimist will tend to adopt a belief that firstly, this is going to last a long time. We're in it for the long haul, people. They also tend to take an approach that is pervasive, that this cuts across everything, that this is going to undermine everything in all areas of life. And finally, the pessimist will also tend to assume fault in some way. They tend to take it a bit personally. This always seems to happen to me. I'm just the kind of person who can never do da-da-da-da. I always end up doing X, Y, or Z, or being the one who this happens to, right? So it becomes about them. And the thing is that it's a perspective where the setbacks are permanent, they're pervasive, they affect everything, and they're personal. And when we actually take that kind of perspective to things, especially when we take this perspective consistently, what that does is it actually ends up trapping us in a feeling of hopelessness, of powerlessness. This is just the way that life is for me, and there's no way out, so what's the point of even trying? And it keeps us stuck and prevents us from actually looking for solutions or ways around it. Not to mention that it's not a lot of fun, right? It leads us to can lead us to a negative experience of life. And there is another approach, right? If we actually look on the other perspective, the person who takes an optimistic interpretation of life, of setbacks, actually takes quite a different approach. They'll be the person who sees this as just temporary. All things pass. After the rain, the sun will shine. The darkest time of nights before the dawn. That's where these kinds of sayings come from. So they look at it as temporary. They see setbacks as being confined to just this one specific case. In other words, just because this has happened in this area, in this one instance, doesn't mean that it's going to affect other things and does not mean that it's going to happen again. It's just a one-off. And so it's really limiting the negativity from it. And the other thing is they don't take it personally, which is super, super powerful. So an optimist will tend to view a bad situation more as a challenge and look for ways of overcoming it, because it can be overcome, because it's just temporary and just a one-off, right? And so what that does is it can lead us to a more proactive, more solution-oriented and more innovative approach. In other words, more resilient and more adaptable. And that's what we need now more than ever. And the really good part of this is, as I said before, wherever we fall naturally on the continuum of pessimistic to optimistic, and there is like a kind of continuum, we can all learn to shift ourselves more towards the optimism end. And there's some practical things we can do for that. Just remember, this is a skill. And like any other skill, it takes practice. It's just like building up a new muscle, right? So in his book, Martin Seligman recommends actually keeping a journal to become more aware of how we respond to adversity and to help us practice making some conscious choices around it. And also so we can see patterns, right? Because that, again, helps us to become more conscious. And that's a super powerful thing to do. As well, when we're journaling things, it helps us to distance ourselves a bit from the emotional part of it and actually be a little bit more objective about things, which is, again, super powerful when we're looking for how can I adapt and be resilient. So the model or approach is something called the ABCDE model. Right? We know our alphabet, it's just the first 5 letters. So I'm going to briefly walk you through what these letters are and how we apply it. And basically by just walking through this model, when something negative happens, when there's a bad event or one of those curveballs of life hits or something doesn't go the way you wanted it to, this is a roadmap to help you navigate the emotional fallout and help you choose a perspective that actually is most resourceful for you. So what do the letters mean? Well, A is the adverse event. We have an adverse thing happen in our life, right? The C stands for the consequences, how we feel as a consequence of that event, right? Now, in between A and C in the alphabet, we always have B, and it's the same here. If we actually step back, B is our beliefs about the event, and it's actually that. It's not the event itself that causes us to feel the way we feel. It's our beliefs about it. It's the interpretation we take, the perspective we take on the event. As Seligman points out, there are often a number of factors or causes behind any given event, including the bad ones. When we are responding to an event and our interpretation, our thoughts, what we tell ourselves about it, often we hone in on just one possible scenario. And so the pessimist will hone in on how can I make this my fault, right? We'll look for the permanent, the pervasive personal interpretation, right? See, this always happens to me because I'm just the kind of person who da-da-da-da-da. That kind of thing, right? However, that's just one interpretation. That's just one possible cause. So what we can do is actually look for other interpretations, and that can actually help us to trigger or turn on alternative emotional responses. And that's really what D is for. Remember, A is the adverse event, B is our beliefs about it, which trigger C, the consequential emotions. So if we feel negative about an event or start beating ourselves up about it, that's a sign to us to actually move to number D, or letter D. D is for disputation, and that's where we can actually consciously distance ourselves from what the interpretation that we've been taking, and actually recognize our beliefs for what they are, which is just beliefs. What are beliefs? Beliefs are simply thoughts that we've thought a lot. Just because it's in our head does not make it true. Just because we believe it does not make it true, right? I won't go into that in any more depth, but it's just recognizing that just because I believe this does not make it true. This is simply a belief. And once we recognize that it's simply a belief, we distance ourselves and recognize a belief for what it is. That gives us the awareness and the opportunity to choose to take another perspective. We can choose to dispute the belief. We can choose to look for contrary evidence that shows that maybe that belief is not the only possible interpretation, or maybe that belief is just simply factually untrue. We can look for different possible perspectives or explanations. In fact, it's quite fun to turn this into a game, right? And challenge ourselves to go, how many alternative interpretations can I find for this particular event? And which one feels most resourceful to me? I'll pick that, thank you very much. Right? So that we're actually taking control of how we respond, which leads us to E. Because, when we take a pessimistic response to something, or it's permanent, it's pervasive, it's personal, we beat ourselves up about it, we go, this is just the way things are, what's the point even trying? That can lead us into quite a passive state, and it can lead us into feelings of dejection. Why bother? Right? Whereas if we shift that perspective, even to one that's non-negative, or one that's optimistic, remember, optimistic being, it's just temporary, it's just limited to this case, and it's not about me, it's not personal. That actually changes things and it energizes us. It energizes us emotionally, and it can actually lead us into alternative, more constructive, resourceful courses of action. Help us rise to the challenge, right? So by consciously doing this, we can actually become aware of patterns. And I do encourage you, actually, if this is an area of challenge, if you want to be more resilient, if you want to be more adaptable, I encourage you to actually take Seligman's advice. And even just for the next, say, 5 negative events that happen in your life, actually do a journal. What's the adverse event? What's your consequential emotion? What are the beliefs that are causing that? And then actually journal the disputation bit. What are alternative beliefs? What's the evidence that the pessimistic belief or unhelpful belief is not actually true? Actually write that out. Play the game, see how many different interpretations you can come up with, and then make a note of how you feel as a result of that. That's the E. What's the shift in your emotional state and in your ability to respond? Because you may find that that's actually quite interesting for you. So there you have it. That is a way to be more resilient and more adaptive. But look, I can also hear the pessimists in the world going, yeah, that's all very fine, Anna. But look, we can't afford to be just 100% optimistic all the time. We live in the real world and stuff happens, and we do need to be realistic, to which I say, absolutely. Being 100% optimistic all the time does have a downside, and the key one is that we'll tend to disregard or minimize or not appropriately manage risks. There are risks in the world. We want to actually look at them and be able to manage them so that we can protect our downside, as Richard Branson puts it. That's important, right? So yes, there are times when taking a more pessimistic perspective is actually valuable and resourceful. The key here is be strategic about it. Consciously choose when you have a risk to manage or when you're in planning and you want to look at protecting that downside, consciously choose a pessimistic approach. Look at, well, what is the worst that could happen? What if it lasts longer, right? Ask those questions and brainstorm around it. Generate a list of all of those possibilities. But then from that standpoint, return to a neutral or even optimistic stance so that you can nut out from a resourceful perspective what are the things we can do now to protect against those risks, to make sure it doesn't happen, right? Because then you're bringing the best of both worlds. And look, at other times, you have the power to choose to take an optimistic or at least a non-negative perspective when those curveballs of life hit, and that will help you to rise to the challenge, to ride the wave, to actually find the opportunities that otherwise you might miss so that you can thrive even in challenging times like these. Okay, so hey, I hope that's been helpful to you. I do encourage you to have a play with that, the game and the exercise. It's made a massive difference in my life and in the lives of clients and others I've worked with as well. So I strongly recommend it. But hey, if you know anyone else as well who you feel would benefit from this, be sure to share this episode with them. This is all about sharing the love, helping more people to become more adaptable and more resilient so that we can make the second half of 2020 so much better than the first half. All right. Thank you again so much for joining me. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes and share with others who can benefit. And I will see you again on another episode soon. Bye for now.